At the very beginning of the Bible, it talks about humans being made in the image of God. That's a big term. What does it mean to be made in the image of God? And if I'm made in the image of God, why do I feel such a huge disconnect in my life when times that I'm feeling unsure about myself, so small in the world? If there's such a high value in humans, how do we reconcile how we feel most of the time? Well, today on Whiskey in the Writings, we're going to go back to the beginning. We're going to explore what it means to be an image bearer. I'm so glad that you've joined us. This channel is for the skeptic, the seeker, those who still believe, but maybe just not like they used to. A place where you can wrestle with your faith honestly with the big questions that we're all trying to ask. My name is Joe Oliver, and for the past 24 years, I used to work in pastoral ministry roles. I have a master's degree in biblical theology, and if you have questions, you're in the right place. Let's get started. Like I said in the opener, we're talking about what it means to be an image bearer. Now, let me set the stage for us. We're going to be looking at places in the Bible that begin to flesh out what this might mean for us today and what the implications are for us later on in our life. And so we're going to be looking at that. We're going to be looking at Jesus and what does it mean for him to be the image of God and what that means for us. And we'll wrap it all up with some thoughts about how we move forward with this reality in the back of our minds. And how does that lead us to the next inevitable question that we'll look at in our next video? What are we to do with that? But before we get into all of those details, let's start off with some whiskey. Today's whiskey is, again, a favorite. I think I say every whiskey is my favorite. I don't know that I've tried a whiskey yet on this channel that I didn't like. So yeah, maybe one day I'll be like, hey, this is our whiskey today, and it's something I don't like. However, that's not the case today. Angel's Envy is a wonderful, just all around great bourbon. If you're looking for something that you can just bring out every once in a while, you're having guests over and you want to do something a little bit higher in value and taste and flavor, you just want to be able to have a good drink with some friends. Angel's Envy, you can't go wrong. It's a great drink. I actually like to drink Angel's Envy when I'm smoking a cigar. For some reason, I like the combination of a cigar and Angel's Envy. So maybe try that if you're a cigar smoker and you want to maybe pair a whiskey with it. But that's what we're drinking today. It's just a great all-around whiskey to have on your shelf. If you only bring it out on certain occasions, it's going to last a long time. But for today, as we're talking about this concept of image bearing, I'm going to share a verse in the Bible that is really about this concept of how humans are the envy of the angels. And so fitting that we're doing Angel's Envy today because we're talking about human beings and being made in the image of God. And so that's what we're drinking today. Whatever you have in front of you, it's all good. Pour a drink, grab a glass. Cheers. Let's get going. All right, we're going to get right into it. Today, we're going to start where all of this conversation of being an image bearer begins, and that's going to be in Genesis chapter 1. If you're a fan of the channel, been following for a while, you know that Genesis chapter 1 is a pivotal part of the story of how we communicate on this channel about what I think God is up to in the world and how we ought to engage with understanding the Bible and what the end is all going to look like. Genesis 1 and 2 are really such pivotal pieces of literature to help frame the narrative and the thematic flow of the Bible. So that's no surprise if you're a fan of the channel. I want to go ahead and point our attention to Genesis chapter 1. We're going to actually start in verse 26. So this is the point where God begins in the story of creation. If You're familiar with it. God had been up to ordering and putting things in its place. And it gets to the point where land had been created and then animals been put on the land. And then right after the animals, you have the creation of humans. So let's go ahead and start in verse 26. It says this: Then God said, let us make humankind in our image. Now, if you have an older translation, you're going to have the word there, Adam, or you're going to have the word man, depending on your translation. A more accurate rendition of what the Hebrew is getting at is humankind. It's male and female. It's all of humanity that God has made. That's what the author's trying to get at. And so I prefer an updated word here that the NET that I'm reading out of here chooses to use, because again, it's getting at the heart of what the author was intending by it, so that we're not at risk of misunderstanding what's happening here. Because at this point in the story, it is not saying that God created a singular human being that is male. Okay, it's literally saying that God made all of humanity. So I prefer the NET, where it says that he said, let us make humankind, humans, in our image. After, he says, our likeness. Okay, so here's where we get into this idea of this connection of image bearing is tied to a likeness. We'll get into that word in a second, but that word likeness is important. So that they may, okay, so there's a so that. So whatever you want to believe about the ordering and creation of the world, the Genesis narrative wants you to believe that there is a so that to your story. And I think this is a pivotal understanding of the creation account. I've said this in videos in the past, and I'm going to flesh this out more in the future, but Genesis 1 and 2 are about two things. They're about the biggest two questions that all of humans have asked since the beginning of humans, wherever you want to put that. Every generation of every human asks these two questions at some point in their life, I believe. That's my opinion. Who am I? Why am I here? These are the two most fundamental questions every human asks of themselves. And how you answer that question can determine the outcome and the pathway for your life. Who am I? What am I here to do? Why am I here? Right? What's my purpose? So you can boil these two words into identity and purpose. Genesis 1 and 2 attempts to get us to understand what our identity and our purpose is, in my opinion. That's my hypothesis. So right out of the gate, let us make humans in our image and after our likeness. Two words there, image and likeness, so that they have a purpose. So it's one thing to be made in the image. It's another thing to talk about what you're to do with that image-bearing identity. Okay, and this is the whole Genesis setup. So that they may rule over the fish, the sea, the birds, the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move on the earth. So I just want to point out for a second that this statement about what the humans are to do have been abused by humans for centuries and millennia. The belief, the twisting of this belief that to rule over something means that we abuse and misuse creation because we are rulers over it, according to Genesis 1, is a misreading of this text. So if we are to be like the likeness and image of the Creator, we must model our actions of ruling like you would expect the one who made us. We are to we're getting into a little bit more in the weeds here, but we're to reflect that quality of God. And so what we cannot do is assume that that means we get to do whatever we want with this earth because we were set up to be rulers. What it does mean is that as rulers, we must do it in consistent harmony with the one who we are imaging after, the Creator God. So I don't think that this means that we can just do whatever we want with this earth. In fact, I think if God said that this earth is very good, I think we actually have a responsibility, if we are in fact images of the Creator, to actually bring good into the earth, not harm. And so as we look at our world today, and we see all the ways in which we're harming our creation, one must wrestle with the reality, if you are a Genesis 1 believer, that believes that what this thing is offering us wisdom and how we ought to be and live today, we have to wrestle with the idea of what's been our role in actually bringing disorder and harm to this earth versus the way that God intended us to do. We're supposed to care for creation, not ruin it. So that's challenging in and of itself, but that's what it's setting itself up to do. So right after this creation narrative, then we have a poem. So it moves into, and if you notice in your Bibles, you'll notice that there is a indentation here that is an arrangement, that there is a poetic structure to what you're about to hear. And it says this: God created humankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, plural, male and female, he created them. So this harkens back to this concept that at the beginning here, God didn't just make one person, he made two. Now, when you read Genesis 2, you're immediately going, well, wait a minute, Joe, isn't Genesis 2 tell us that God started with a male before he created the female out of the male? The narrative does point us to that, but I don't think in the ways that you assume it does. And we'll look at that in our next video. That's not for this conversation. The point is that God made these images, then there's this poetic stance that comes out of this to reaffirm the role of the humans to be image bearers, both humans, not just one. There is no hierarchy in this narrative. Right? Any attempt to bring a hierarchical point of view is against what the Genesis 1 narrative gives us. Now, again, I know your mind's going to, but like, well, isn't Genesis 2 a look back on day 6 where he explains a little bit more in detail these verses? No, it's not. In fact, I know of no credible scholars that actually think that Genesis 2 is a look back at Genesis 1 and giving us more details about what happened on Genesis 1. That is not what's happening. And so again, I'm setting you up for maybe video 2 where we can explain that if you have those questions. But for now, you just need to know that male and female both contain the image-bearing spark that God has put in humanity. Male and female both have it. That's undeniable. That's right there in the text. Okay, and so in verse 28, God blessed them, said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea. And again, it's another calling to be rulers over this thing that God had set up. Maybe a more accurate word there would be managers. We are managing God's creation. We do not own God's creation. We manage it, and the Genesis ideal is that we manage it with God, not apart from God. That's, again, deeper thoughts that we can look at a little bit later. But I want to look at a couple things here. These words here, image and likeness, are specific words in Hebrew. The word image is the word tselem, which is a specific, it means image, but it means representation, but it also can mean shadow. So image, a representation, or a shadow. I like that word shadow because I think it's like if you have the Creator, he made us like a shadow, an image, a representation of the Creator, albeit not of the same substance. And that's what the word likeness comes in. The word likeness is much like resemblance, but it's not of the same substance. Okay, so this image, this shadow, this thing that we are, is a resemblance, not of the same substance of God. So there's something special about the humans that he does not say of any other parts of creation. No other creation carries with it this identity of image bearing that the humans are supposed to have. And that's extremely, extremely important. As we go on and we look at this reality, there's a couple things I want to know. In Psalms chapter 8, there's this interesting statement that's made about the humans in relationship to other spiritual beings. Okay, so there are other spiritual beings out there. The biblical writers fully imagined and realized that there are other spiritual beings in and around this world. The notion that there is only a singular God is not a biblical concept. The biblical writers believed fully that there were powers and an unseen world, an unseen realm that was a part of their world, albeit somewhat distant and something that was hard to obtain. Okay, so in Psalms chapter 8, you have this great stance. Already in the Genesis 1, we know that no other created thing, whether that's fish, birds, animals on the ground, things that are created, none of them have an image bearing likeness and resemblance that the humans seem to have. And we find out in this poetic psalm, in Psalm chapter 8, it says this in verse 4: "Of what importance is the human race that you should notice them?" It's a great question. Why are humans important that God would want to be a part of the thing that we're up to? Or what importance is mankind that you should pay attention to them? You made them a little less than the heavenly beings. Okay, so you have God, you have heavenly beings, and this author saying you made them a little less because we are of a different substance than of these types of beings. However, even though we were made a little less, there's something that it says about it. You crowned mankind with honor and majesty. You appoint them to rule over your creation. You have placed everything under their authority. And so what we see here is this reiteration of what we read in Genesis 1. And yet at this point in the story, though, it's more than just simply these created fleshly things, birds, fish, sea, animals, or land animals, cattle, whatever. The psalmist includes these spiritual beings, a little less than the angels, and yet you chose them to rule. And so that's why I chose angels' envy. You see why here is that there's an aspect that humans are actually distinctly unique, even set apart from the spiritual beings that we would assume are more closely related to a God figure. And so the humans are set up. The humans are set up to be a representation of God. And I've made this illustration before, but Carmen Joy Imes wrote a book called Bearing God's Name. And in it, this book talks about how this word image is actually used in other places in the Old Testament. The Israelites had a word, and this word image, and it was used in different ways. So for instance, the same word that's used selam here as image is the same word that's used translated later in, like, for instance, the commandments of not worshiping other idols. You should have no other God before me. The commandments to not have idol worship is a specific word, idol, meaning selam, which is connected to the Genesis chapter 1 image word of selam. Now, why is that important? Because one might ask the question, why would God command the Israelites to not worship anything, no other idol? Because if you understand that you yourself are the image of the Creator, there then requires no need to worship anything else. So for instance, idols were carved figurines in the ancient world that represented figuratively the God that they worshiped. And so if you wanted to pay homage, or if you wanted to give tribute to the gods, you would point it to this image figure. Or if you wanted to see what the god looked like, you would look at this image figure. And so these idols exist all over the ancient world. There's plenty of stories in the Old Testament about how the Israelites turned to these false gods, as they called them. And this breaks God's heart, because God says, why would you turn yourself away when, if you want to see who I am, you look at the creation that I made in my likeness and image? So God says, don't worship any other idols, because you are in fact his idol. You don't need to make anything. He made you. So there is a high value placed on the human beings. And I set all of this up in this early part of this video, the writings, because I want you to see and understand that no matter like where you're at in life, you need to know that you matter, that you are of high value to God because you bear his image. Now, we can talk about ways in which we misrepresent the image of God and the ways that we fall short on reflecting and shadowing the image of the Creator. But the Genesis ideal is that you have in you the spark of the divine Creator. No matter who you are, no matter what race you belong to, no nationality that you're a part of, no matter who you are or where you come from, your sex, your identity, you are created in God's image. You are an image bearer. You have value. And Genesis 1 sets us up, and Psalms 8 reaffirms that there's something uniquely special about the humans. And so in our next segment here, when we go into I'm Just Saying, we're going to look a little bit deeper about ways that we mess that up and how we can get back on track in being a good image bearer to God. That's in I'm Just Saying. Okay, for the I'm Just Saying, we're going to look at Jesus. And we're going to look at Jesus because there's a lot going on with Jesus's life and the ways in which the New Testament writers looked back onto Jesus and their experience and began to imagine or understand or reimagine what he was doing here on this earth and why he was doing what he was doing on this earth. And so we're going to look into this a little bit deeper, but I want to set the stage to say this. If Genesis 1 and 2 is this reality of communicating to us the value that humans have in this world, Genesis 3 shows us what happens when we reject that image-bearing quality, or in fact, we choose for ourselves how we want to be images rather than trusting God in what he outlines for the best way to be his image. Okay, so this is like the problem that the whole narrative and thematic overview of the Bible is working through. Genesis 1 and 2, it's all very good. God set it up, it's good. Genesis 3, the humans reject that reality and choose for themselves. The outflowing of that is harm and disunity and chaos being entered into the earth through humans until God eventually steps in and starts working with a new family to try to right the ship, as it were, and bring things back together. And so the story of it is that this family, that's the story of the Old Testament, this family is the people that are supposed to show the world what it looks like to walk in partnership and harmony with God, and in doing so bringing good back into the earth. This is the thing that is talked about in Genesis 12 as the promise to Abraham, that he would be a blessing to all the nation. The blessing is that through this family, they would be the ones to point people back to the Creator God, Yahweh. They do it right all the time? Clearly not, right? That's the point of the whole Old Testament, is this reality that this family keeps falling short of living up to their vocation, the things that God had asked them to do. All that to say, we get to a point in the story where at the end of the Old Testament, one's left asking the question, is there any hope? Is there any hope? I mean, we just read all of these stories that date, back centuries, and we see all of these failings and all of these missed opportunities. And one might ask the question, is there anyone that can do this? Is there anyone who can lead? Is there anyone who can show us the way? Enter Jesus. And so the New Testament authors, living decades after the time and events of Jesus, writing back and reflecting on their time and the stories that were told about him, are actually reimagining and seeing the true reality of Jesus and his coming. And so they write certain things that I think are really important for us to call out. And I'm going to call out a few of them, which in the Bible for us to reflect on. So the first one is Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. And I'm just going to go ahead and turn there. Colossians, it's back, chapter 1, verse 15. All right. It says this in Colossians chapter 1, verse 15. So this is a guy named Paul. He's writing to this church in Colossae, and he begins to give this like narrative poem. This is either a song that is being shared to this church, or it's a well-known creed that's being shared with this church. We're really unsure what this stance from 15 to 20 actually is, but you'll notice in your Bibles it's been truncated, much like the poem in Genesis 1 that we looked at earlier. So that's an indication that this is something different. So whether, again, I think it might be a song, an early Christian song that was sung, but at the very least, maybe it was a creed that was shared. And the very beginning of it, the thing that the Christians believed about Jesus is this: he is the image, there's that word, of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Okay, out of the gate, this stance here in Colossians chapter 1, 15 through 20 is a very early Christian writing. What that means is this, that we can probably assume that within 5, 10, 15 years of Christianity post Jesus' resurrection, beliefs and ideas were being shared, sung about, and formulated into creedal thought. Like in 1 Corinthians 15, we get a very similar situation that Paul shares with that church in Corinth. So this is at the outset of Christianity. This is something they believed. He is the image of the invisible God. Now, think about that for a second. This automatically, when we read this, our brain should be pinging Genesis 1, right? In that, if we struggle to understand what God is like, if he's invisible to us, who makes him visible? Paul seems to think, and wherever he got this psalm or creed, seems to think that it's Jesus. That Jesus is the truest image of God. So if you were to, and he says the firstborn over all creation, he's tying this to a Genesis 1 theological point of view. This is a theological statement. In theology, simply, it's the simplest way to define theology is what we think about God, okay? So the theological point of view of this opening stance is that if we're to know what that first humans being image bearers were supposed to look like, Jesus is the one that looks like. So that is a huge, huge statement. Huge statement. Okay, maybe I'll I did a Trump impression. Oh, God, help me. On this channel. At any rate, I may cut that. I may not. I don't know. It is a very big statement for the author to make. Let's look at another example. This is actually in Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3. It says this: the Son is the radiance of his glory and the representation, likeness, representation of his essence. And he sustains all things by his powerful word. So the writer of Hebrews, whoever that is telling us, again, a theological point of view as they look back at Jesus, that he is actually the representation. So you have image and you have likeness in the New Testament biblical thought about Jesus, that Jesus is that thing. The point here is this, okay? If you are an image bearer, if you're truly an image bearer, and you're not sure how to do image bearing well, if you were to make it a vocation, you only need look at the life of Jesus. The New Testament writers would say to you, if you were to ask Paul or the writer of Hebrews, how do I do image bearing? They would say, look at the life and the teachings of Jesus and do your best to follow those. That's what it means to be an image bearer. So to wrap up this I'm just saying here, if you're struggling with who you are and the value that you have in this earth, maybe you've been told you're worth nothing. Maybe you're told you'll amount to nothing. Maybe you've experienced so much hardship and pain that you don't even know that you have value on this earth. I want you to know that the story of the Bible is trying to get you to see that you do have value, that God is so He so desires to see you become who he knows you can be, that he himself came, the biblical story would tell us, in human form to show us how to live the life he's calling us into. And one may call that the good life. And so to wrap up this whole point of view, and I'm sure there's more I could say about this, but to wrap up this whole point of view, I just want to leave you with this. For now, you're asking the question, okay, Joe, so I got to look at Jesus. How do I do that? I want you to spend time in what's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's found in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7. I want you to read chapters 5, 6, and 7 and make that your devotion or your reading, or you're reading for the first time. Maybe you've never opened it there. Go to your table of contents, find Matthew. It's going to be in the back. And that chapter 5, 6, and 7 are pivotal for you to understand the value or the ethic that Jesus desires for us, or what he's inviting us into, and how we actually live and organize our lives. And in doing so, if we follow the way of Jesus, here's what he promised those who followed him, that you will have life and life more abundantly. And so if you're looking to tie yourself into the good life, and you've struggled to find that reality, may I suggest that you simply read Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, then do your best to model yourself after those ideals and ethics and see where that takes you. All right, that's what we got for I'm Just Saying. I want to thank you for joining me today on Whiskey and the Writings. It's been a great conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it. And if you have, maybe you might share it with someone around you, someone in your life that needs to hear this. Hopefully that it's been a valuable resource for you. I want to thank you for just participating and being a part of it. I want you to remember that God's story's good. It's still good. Even if you have experienced a bad version of that from people around you, know that God's story is good, and there's still a part for you to play in it. We don't judge Jesus by the abuse done in his name. We only judge him by what he says. Spend some time in Matthew chapter 5, 6, and 7, and let's see where that takes us. Thank you for joining me. I'm so glad you're here. And until next time, cheers.